This is a short presentation on the Nazis' use of terror and propaganda from 1933 to 1945. And you would have to argue that they used it so successfully, during that time, that that was one of the big reasons why the war, particularly in Europe, went on for so long. Starting off on the left-hand side, and obviously the man really responsible for Nazi terror from 1933 to 1945 is Himmler, this gentleman here. In case you don't know anything about Heinrich Himmler, Heinrich was an ex-chicken farmer. He was an early member of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s. He was one of Hitler's most loyal lieutenants. And in the mid-1920s, Himmler was responsible for setting up an organisation that you've probably heard of called the SS. The SS actually started off in 1925-26 as Hitler's bodyguard. But it actually later went on to become a number of other things. So from 1934 onwards, it began to develop into a much bigger and more complex organisation. Towards the end of the 1930s, it incorporated the Death's Head units. The Death's Head units were responsible for the concentration camp structure, for manning camps like Dachau, the first concentration camp that was set up in 1933, and others thereon. Their units were responsible for the administration, for the control of the concentration camp structure, therefore perpetrating terror on not only the population of Germany, but also on the occupied territories, because the last place you wanted to end up was in a concentration camp ran by the SS, who of course were ruthless. They were fanatical Nazis. They believed 100% in what they were doing. And the third, in fact I'll number these, the third one that's really kind of important was the Waffen SS. And the Waffen SS came to more prominence after 1939 because they, of course, were part of the German army. One thing to make absolutely clear: the Wehrmacht, the standard German army, the German army of professional soldiers, they were very different to the SS. A lot of those soldiers weren't Nazis for a start, so their attitude towards the Waffen SS, these were fanatical, Nazis, most of them. They'd volunteered for service in the SS, which shows you how fanatical about the cause they were. The army's attitude towards the Waffen SS was quite hostile sometimes, and a lot of that came about because of their kind of fanatical and hardline attitude, the killing of civilians, the killing of women and children in Russia halfway through the war. Really sent terror through the army, but also when German citizens heard about this, it created this mystique about the SS, and Himmler himself actually modelled the SS on the Jesuit order, on the order set up by the Catholic Church, for its organisation, for its secrecy, for its rituals, and his vision for the SS was this all-conquering SS empire of Aryan men controlling Europe, essentially. But the SS was just one aspect of Nazi terror. As I've already mentioned, you have the concentration camp structure. And you could be sent there from 1933 onwards. I mentioned that in 1933 the first camp was set up at Dachau. The original camps were not death camps. They didn't have gas chambers. They were not murder factories. You could be sent there as a political prisoner. You could be sent there as a gypsy. You could be sent there as a homosexual. You weren't, initially at least, sent there to die. A lot of people, of course, did die because they were forced to, do manual labour, really, really hard labour. But they weren't put into gas chambers. They weren't summarily executed. in the early days at least. Of course, camps like Dachau during the war became, just as notorious as Auschwitz or some of the death camps with gas chambers in them. And of course, German people knew, because I mean, Dachau was in Germany. A lot of the death camps were in Poland, but the concentration camps, a lot of them were in Germany. So the German people didn't want to go there. You didn't want to end up there, and there was that fear factor, and it was a deterrent for a lot of opposition groups who understood the consequences of getting caught and understood the consequences of what could happen to them. Obviously, another factor in the terror campaign was the People's Court. It was led by a gentleman called Roland Freisler. He was the chief judge in the People's Court. It was essentially a Nazi court. The judges were Nazi, the solicitors were Nazi, there was no jury, the members of the gallery were Nazis, the sentences passed out were draconian, they were harsh, there was lots of death penalties handed out. Basically, there was no justice. The most famous, you might want to read about it, but one of the famous cases conducted in the People's Court was that of Sophie Scholl, Anna Briller-Hans, who opposed the Nazis and were treated, mercilessly. There was no justice there was no fairness about the trial. So the People's Court in itself was an instrument of terror. You knew that if you were suspected of opposing the Nazis, if you were caught giving out leaflets or putting graffiti on walls, then you could end up in the People's Court, and the likelihood is you could get the death penalty, or you could get some 20 years hard labour in a concentration camp. You don't want to end up in that situation. And beyond that, of course, is probably one of the most famous instruments of Nazi terror, which was the Gestapo, which was a growing organisation in the 1930s. By 1940, it had 40,000 operatives operating across Europe. Of course, the war started in 1939, but even before then, it was a very powerful and strong organisation. What was it? It was essentially a secret police. There was no uniform. The officers of the Gestapo didn't wear a uniform. They would read people's mail. They would listen to people's complaints. They would encourage children to tell tales on their parents. They would torture and intimidate in an interview setting anybody who was taken into custody on the lines of being anti-Nazi. Nobody knew who the Gestapo were. It was a secret police. That the normal police force, of course, had uniforms as they had in the Weimar Republic years. The Gestapo was a secret police. No one knew who they were. No one knew if they were listening to your conversations or if they were gonna, get involved in what you were trying to do. So, all of these organisations, the incredibly powerful SS, the system of concentration camps, the People's Court, and the Gestapo, were all very, very effective in controlling the German population through deterrent and through fear, because essentially that's what terror is. It's fear, and it's spreading that fear as much as it possibly can. On the other hand, you have another strategy. You've got Himmler's, and these two, I suppose, are polar opposites in the techniques they were actually using. You've got Himmler's kind of heavy-handed terror campaign going on the one hand over here, but at the same time, you have a very intense propaganda campaign across Germany from 1933 onwards, and that would take many forms. New technologies like radio had made it very easy and for the Nazis to give shortwave radios away free. People wanted to listen to radio. You might call it the internet of the 1930s, or the smartphones of the 1930s. People were always listening, and because the Nazis could control those radio stations, the content was Nazified. Hitler's speeches, Hitler's favourite songs, Goebbels' speeches, propaganda stories, actual dramas acted out with a propaganda message. Posters. Loudspeakers. They actually installed loudspeakers on the ends of many streets. They would churn out Hitler's speeches. They would churn out updates and news. Of course, a lot of it manipulated or falsified. And it became a bit of a bombardment, really. You had your radio, your loudspeakers, your posters, books. Books were censored. If you don't know what that means, it basically means they were edited. Bits were taken out of them. Bits were changed. And this was effective because obviously the type of books that were censored were any books that were a threat to the Nazis. So any Jewish literature would be censored. Of course, you had famous book burnings. A massive book burning took place in May 1933 when the Nazis had actually just come to power in Germany, and that became, there's a very famous image on Google of all the books being burned outside a university in Berlin. So books were censored, and of course Goebbels' favourite form of propaganda, is kind of plaything, was cinema, and he made lots of famous films. Triumph of the Will would have been one of the most famous ones. It was basically a film of a Nuremberg rally, containing a centerpiece speech by Hitler. It contained images of all the Nazi leadership. It presented Hitler as some kind of demigod. And, it was about presenting the Hitler myth, this idea that he was somehow slightly above humanity in his decision-making, and he had this special aura about him. And through cinema, which again was a relatively new medium. I mean, talking cinema only came about from the late 1920s onwards. So the Nazis really utilised this new technology, and Goebbels, which is this gentleman here, was obviously incredibly important in the sense that he was the proponent. He was the man with the ideas when it came to what they were going to do. And of course, the last one is newspapers. The Nazis already owned 120 newspapers by 1933. By the end of the 1930s, they literally had control over the newspaper industry. And of course, a big part of that was the fact that editors would have to ask Goebbels for permission to write and print stories that they wanted to. So it's really, really, a really important form of propaganda because newspapers were the most popular form of news back then. And I suppose all of these things pushed out messages, anti-Jew messages, anti-communist messages. They pushed out messages about the Nazis' need to create living space, Lebensraum. To invade other countries, in other words. All of these messages were blended together and became a really powerful form of control. Now the next question is, which one of these, terror or propaganda, were the most significant? Which one had the biggest, which one really control people the most, or was most effective in controlling the population? And that is a difficult question. That's one for debate. That's one that historians have debated, and that's one that